They dropped me off by helicopter late in the morning. The pilot barely spoke as we flew over an endless sea of trees, the old-growth forest stretching in every direction like a green ocean. The park was vast, miles upon miles of wilderness, untouched and unbothered. The landing zone was nothing more than a small clearing with a supply cache, and as soon as I grabbed my gear, the helicopter lifted off again, disappearing into the distance. And just like that, I was alone. A deep, steady silence settled around me. No distant hum of cars, no voices, no planes overhead. Just the whisper of wind through the towering trees. It was a kind of quiet I wasn't used to. I shouldered my pack and started walking. The hike to my post, Southwest Tower, was 5 miles through dense forest. The air was cool, damp with the scent of pine needles and moss. The canopy above was thick, casting long shadows across the trail. Every so often I caught glimpses of movement in the underbrush. Deer watching me cautiously, a fox slinking through the ferns, a squirrel darting up a tree. The wildlife here was abundant, the forest alive. I liked it. The solitude didn't bother me. If anything, it was a relief. A year ago, I had graduated college with a degree in communications and a minor in ecology. I imagined I'd land a decent job, maybe something in environmental outreach or park services, but reality hit hard. No one was hiring. The jobs I could find barely paid enough to survive. And now, with my student loans kicking in, I was desperate for something stable. The idea of spending my life trapped in a cubicle filled me with a slow, creeping dread. That's when I saw a post from an old classmate, celebrating his 1-year anniversary as a park ranger. A light bulb went off in my head. I had never thought about joining the park ranger service. Maybe my degree in ecology would give me a leg up. I reached out, asked him about the job. He suggested becoming a Firewatch, said it was a good way to get my foot in the door, see if I liked the work. 3 months later, here I was. By the time I reached the tower, the sun had begun its slow descent behind the ridgeline. Southwest Tower was old, at least 70 years, but sturdy. A metal staircase wound its way up to the enclosed observation deck. From the top, I could see for miles, rolling hills covered in trees, stretching out like an untouched wilderness. The cabin itself was simple: a bunk, a small stove, a desk, and a radio. Despite its age, the tower had been outfitted with solar panels, which provided just enough power for the essentials: lights, a mini fridge, and my laptop. No cell service, no internet. But I had a library of downloaded movies to keep me entertained. The days passed in routine. Mornings were spent scanning the horizon for smoke. Afternoons, I hiked the surrounding trails, learning the land. Evenings, I checked in with the other lookouts over the radio. There were 3 of us. Bill, stationed at East Tower, was a veteran, 23 years in the job, 4 of them at East. He was gruff but friendly, always quick with a story or some old bit of advice. Angela was at North Tower. This was her 4th year at that post, her 5th overall. She was sharp, easygoing, and always had something to say about the books she was reading. We checked in every night before signing off. It became a ritual, a comfort in the isolation. For a while, everything was fine. I settled into the routine, the quiet, the solitude. A little over a month had passed since my arrival, and I was loving it. The days had settled into a comfortable rhythm: morning reports, afternoon hikes, quiet nights filled with old movies and radio chatter. The isolation didn't bother me at all, not with Bill and Angela keeping me company over the radio. I got to really know Bill and Angela. Bill was single, with no living family, and this lifestyle of a Firewatch suited him just fine. The solitude didn't bother him. In fact, he preferred it. He used to joke that he'd been in the forest so long, the trees knew him by name. Bill was curt, but easygoing, the kind of man who sounded perpetually unimpressed by everything. But deep down, you knew he cared. He'd always chime in with some dry-witted remark during our nightly radio check-ins, followed by a long, gravelly chuckle. And then there were his stories. Strange things he'd seen out here over the years. Unexplained lights deep in the forest. Disembodied voices drifting through the trees at night. A hiker who vanished without a trace, tent and all, except for a single boot found miles from his campsite. I always got the sense that Bill wasn't just telling stories for fun. He was warning us. Angela was pure joy. She always updated us on whatever book she was reading, whether it was a classic novel or some weird horror story that was way too close to home for this job. She was also an amateur photographer, using her time out here to document the beauty of the park. She had a real eye for it, too. She didn't just take pictures of landscapes or wildlife. She captured the feeling of the forest, the way the light bled through the canopy in the early mornings, the way the mist clung to the valleys after it rained. She had a whole external hard drive full of shots she was planning to compile into a book someday. It wasn't the same as having people physically nearby, but our radio conversations filled the silence, gave the job some warmth, made the wilderness feel less empty. Even though we were miles apart, we grew closer and closer through our radio chats as the days went by. We became true friends, Bill with his old man wisdom and eerie stories, Angela with her dry humor and endless curiosity. And me? I was just grateful to have them on the other end of the radio. For a while, everything was fine. That morning started like any other. I woke early, made coffee, and stood on the observation deck as the sun crept over the horizon. The forest stretched out in all directions, endless and undisturbed. It was one of my favorite moments of the day, watching the world wake up, the mist hanging low in the valleys, birds calling in the distance. I had a supply drop scheduled. Once a month, a helicopter flew overhead and dropped a crate at a designated clearing a few miles from my tower. Basic rations, canned goods, dehydrated snacks, batteries, and anything else I had requested. I finished my coffee, did a routine sweep of the horizon with my binoculars, then packed my gear for the hike. That's when I saw it. A dark smudge on the eastern horizon. I lowered the binoculars, rubbed my eyes, and looked again. It wasn't smoke. It was too low, too thick. A dense, rolling mass, like a storm cloud, but hugging the ground. I frowned. Weather had been clear all week, and I hadn't heard anything about a front moving in. I grabbed the radio. "East Tower, this is Southwest. You seeing this?" Bill's voice crackled through. Yeah, I see it." A pause. "Weird, huh?" "Looks like fog," I said, "but it's moving strange." Bill grunted. "Yeah. Don't usually get fog this time of year. Not like that. And not from the east. But hey, it'll probably burn off before it gets here." He didn't sound concerned, but something in his voice felt off. I nodded to myself even though he couldn't see me. "All right, just checking in." "No worries. Have fun on your hike." I clipped the radio back onto my belt and tried to shake the unease creeping into my gut. It was just fog. Nothing weird about fog. I pushed it from my mind and set off for the supply drop. The hike was peaceful. The usual bird song and rustling of small animals in the brush. By early afternoon, I reached the clearing and found my crate waiting for me, packed tight with everything I needed. I loaded up my pack and headed back. But when I reached the tower, I stopped dead in my tracks. The fog had moved. It wasn't a distant smear on the horizon anymore. It had surged forward, swallowing miles of forest in just a few hours. Thick and unnaturally dark, it crawled along the ground like a living thing. And it was heading straight for East Tower. I grabbed the radio again. "Bill, you there?" A long pause. Then, yeah. His voice was different now. Tense. "Fog's moving faster than I thought," I said carefully. "You all right?" Yeah, I'm fine." Just a sharp breath. Forest is quiet. I frowned. Quiet how? Just quiet. No birds, no wind. Feels strange. A creeping chill washed over me. I had spent enough time in the wilderness to know that silence wasn't normal. Even on the stillest days, the forest was never truly quiet. Insects buzzed, birds called, trees creaked. A dead, silent forest meant something was very, very wrong. I swallowed. Maybe it's nothing. Bill exhaled sharply, almost like a laugh. Yeah, maybe. Neither of us believed that. That night when we checked in over the radio, the mood had changed. Angela had seen the fog now too. She didn't like it. Doesn't feel right, she said. Conditions aren't right for fog. It shouldn't be moving like this. Bill was quiet. Angela chuckled. Come on, Bill, you're always telling ghost stories. You should be loving this. Bill didn't laugh. Instead, he said, You think this is why Malcolm retired? Silence. Angela and I exchanged a glance that neither of us could see. Malcolm. Before me, Malcolm had been stationed in this tower, Southwest Tower, for over 30 years. He had retired at the end of last season. Said he was done. Said he was lucky he had survived as long as he had. But the last few months of his post had been strange. He had changed, grown paranoid, kept urging Bill and Angela to transfer out, to take other assignments far away, told them he wouldn't make it through another season. He never explained why. Angela hesitated. You think he knew about this? I don't know, Bill muttered. Just feels ominous. No one spoke for a long time. Then Bill broke the silence. The fog's about a couple of hours out now. That was fast. Too fast. Angela's voice came through, quieter now. Bill, do you have a game plan? Just in case? I stay put. I mean, what else can I do? If it gets bad, just... Something else is weird, Bill interrupted. The animals. They left. I sat up straighter. What do you mean? I've been watching them all day. Birds, deer, even bears, moving away from the fog. Fast. I didn't like that. Animals had instincts. They didn't wait around for danger to arrive. You think it's just regular weather, Bill? Angela asked. Silence. Then Bill said, I think I hear something in the fog. Angela snorted. Oh, come on. I'm serious. The closer it gets, I'm sure I'm hearing something. Something in his voice made my skin crawl. Voices, he said. I don't know. Maybe screaming. Angela laughed nervously. Okay, Bill. Very funny. I'm not joking. Silence. Then, barely above a whisper, it's getting closer. There was another awkward lull in the conversation before we wished each other well and signed off for the night. I'm pretty sure none of us slept that night. Morning came, but the unease from the night before hadn't left me. I woke up groggy, the kind of exhaustion that comes from pretending to sleep while your mind refuses to shut down. The room felt colder than usual. Outside, the sky was a thick, unbroken gray, overcast and heavy, the kind of weather that made everything feel smaller, more suffocating. The light was weak, dull, casting no real shadows. It felt wrong, like the sun had given up. I made coffee, stood on the deck, and looked toward the east. The fog had nearly swallowed the horizon. It was closer than it should have been. I grabbed the radio. Bill, you up? Static. I frowned. Bill always responded. Even when he was groggy, even when he was grumpy, he never missed a morning check-in. East Tower. This is Southwest. You there? More static. I glanced north. Angela's tower was out of sight, hidden behind the ridgelines, but I clicked the radio anyway. Angela, you hear from Bill? A second later, her voice came through. No, I've been trying since I woke up. Her voice was different, tight, strained. I hesitated. Maybe he just overslept. Bill? She almost laughed, but there was no humor in it. He's been doing this for 22 years, Chucky. He doesn't oversleep. She was right. I tried again. Bill, come on, man, wake up. Static. Angela exhaled through the mic. I don't like this. I rubbed my face, trying to shake off the growing unease. Could be his radio. Bad connection. Then why was it working fine last night? I didn't have an answer for that. We spent the next 2 hours taking turns calling Bill. Nothing. The fog had reached his tower by now. Angela broke the silence. I'm calling HQ. I hesitated. Calling headquarters wasn't something we did lightly. If we raised the alarm over nothing, it would follow us through the rest of our careers. A permanent mark. Panicked over bad weather. But this wasn't just bad weather. Do it. A click. Silence. Then Angela again. HQ, this is North Tower. We have a problem. A long pause. Then a voice. Calm, controlled. Go ahead, North Tower. Angela glanced at me over the invisible line between us. It's Bill. He's not responding. It's been hours. Another pause. Then the voice, more serious now. You're sure? Positive. I leaned toward my radio. I'm Southwest Tower. I've been trying too. He was fine last night, but now, nothing. A sharp exhale. Then, hold, please. Click. Silence. Angela and I sat there listening to the dead air, waiting. Finally, a new voice came through. Older. Rougher. This is David. I'm with the regional office. Angela and I exchanged glances again. David wasn't just some dispatcher. Tell me exactly what's going on, he said. Angela laid it out. How we'd all spoken the night before. How Bill had last reported that the fog was an hour out. How he'd mentioned hearing screams. The animal exodus. How the forest had gone silent. And how, now, Bill was gone. David didn't speak for a long time. Then, finally, we're sending a helicopter. Relief flooded through me, then vanished just as fast. But, David continued, we have a problem. My stomach tightened. Weather systems moved in from the west. Wind speeds are too high for a safe flight. We can't get anyone in for at least 2 days. Angela swore. I forced my voice to stay steady. So what do we do? David hesitated. Stay put. Both of you. Don't leave your towers. Don't go looking for Bill. We'll be there as soon as we can. Angela's voice was shaking now. And what if the fog gets to us before that? Another pause. I mean, it's just fog. But you can play it safe and lock your doors, David said. And don't let anything in. Click. The line went dead. Angela and I sat in silence, listening to the static. Neither of us said what we were thinking. Bill had locked his doors too, and it hadn't helped him. The wind picked up in the afternoon. I could hear it groaning through the wooden beams of the tower, making the walls creak, the windows rattle. The sky was still that heavy, suffocating gray, thick with clouds that never seemed to break. No sun, no real light. Just an endless dimness that made it feel later in the day than it was. Angela and I hadn't spoken much since our call with HQ. I think we were both trying to process it. Bill was gone. The fog had reached his tower. The animals had fled before it arrived, and the forest had gone silent. And now HQ had told us the one thing neither of us wanted to hear. Stay put. Wait. Don't leave your towers. But Angela wasn't the waiting type. The radio crackled. Southwest, you there? I clicked the mic. Yeah, I'm here. A pause. Then, I can't do it, Chucky. I swallowed. Do what? Sit here and wait for the fog to get me. I exhaled through my nose. Angela. No, listen. Her voice was sharp. She was barely holding it together. You saw how fast it moved on Bill. You saw how the animals reacted. I'm not waiting to be next. I knew where this was going. So what's the plan? I'm coming to you. It wasn't a surprise, but hearing her say it out loud made my stomach twist. It's a 5-hour hike, Angela. I know. The wind's picking up. Weather's getting worse. I know. The fog is still half a day behind me. Listen, Chucky, it's either now or never. I hesitated. And what if it speeds up? What if it cuts you off? She didn't answer right away. Then quietly, then I guess I run. That was the part that made my skin crawl. This wasn't just some bad storm or weird weather pattern. It was something worse. Something that moved like it was alive. I pressed the mic again. You bringing the walkie? Yeah, of course. Got it clipped to my pack. Check in often. I will. A gust of wind howled against the tower, making the wooden beams groan. The sky was getting darker, and it wasn't even late yet. I gripped the radio tighter. Angela, listen to me. If things get bad, if you hear something, I won't stop. Her voice was firmer now. I don't care what's in that fog, Chucky. I am not sitting here and waiting for it. I knew there was no talking her out of it. All right, I said quietly. Come quick. She was already moving. I checked the fog every 30 minutes. At midday, it still seemed distant. A thick, dark wall slowly consuming the land behind Angela's tower. It was moving at a steady crawl, sluggish, like it had all the time in the world. By mid-afternoon, the wind had gotten worse, howling through the trees, making the wooden stairs creak and shudder. I checked the fog again. Had it moved faster? I wasn't sure. But by the time the sun dipped toward the horizon, it was noticeably closer. And when the last of the daylight faded, something changed. I lifted my binoculars, peering into the dim twilight. The fog had been creeping along all day, but now it looked like it had gained ground. Had it always moved this fast after dark? I checked my watch. Angela still had an hour and a half left on her hike. I tried to focus on something else, anything else. But every time I looked back, the fog seemed to close the distance faster than before. My gut twisted. Did it move slower at midday? Faster when it was dark? I didn't want to know the answer. By the time the last stretch of her hike began, the sun had set. I had kept every single light on in the tower, turning my little cabin into a beacon in the darkness. The wind was howling now, slamming against the walls, making the wood groan and pop under the strain. I checked the ridge to the north with my binoculars. Nothing yet. Angela was still ahead of the fog, but it didn't matter. It was the silence that was getting to her. The radio hissed with interference. The walkies weren't meant to work over long distances, but the fact that the signal was getting worse meant something else was interfering. Another gust of wind slammed into the tower. Then, a noise from below. A shuffle. A faint thud against the wooden stairs. I went still. Something was moving at the base of my tower. I grabbed the axe. My knuckles turned white around the handle. Another noise. A shuffle. A faint creak against the steps. I raised the axe, bracing for the worst. Then, bang. I jumped so hard I nearly dropped the axe. The trapdoor shook violently as something slammed against it from below. Then, Chucky, let me in. Angela. I scrambled forward so fast I nearly tripped over myself. Unlocked the hatch, threw it open. Angela hauled herself inside, gasping, soaked in sweat despite the cold. I slammed the door shut, locking it behind her. For a long moment, we just sat there on the floor, breathless. Angela's face was pale, her hands shaking. I grabbed the kettle, made 2 mugs of coffee, and handed her one. She took it with both hands, gulping it down without a word. Then she looked at me. "It's coming." I didn't ask what it was. We already knew. Angela was asleep in my bunk when I woke up. I had let her take the bed while I slept on the floor, but my body didn't seem to appreciate the favor. My back ached, my neck stiff as I sat up, rubbing the sleep from my eyes. It was still early. The light filtering through the windows was weak, gray, and dull. I didn't need to look outside to know the clouds hadn't broken. I climbed to my feet, careful not to wake Angela, and stepped out onto the deck. The first thing I noticed was how cold it was. Even at this elevation, in the middle of June, it shouldn't have been this cold. The second was the fog. It had gained significant ground overnight. I swallowed, gripping the railing as I studied it. Thicker than before. Darker. It had only been a distant smudge on the horizon when I first spotted it 2 days ago. But now we had only a few hours. I exhaled slowly, rubbing my hands together for warmth before heading back inside. Angela was stirring. She shifted under the blankets, eyes still closed, nose twitching slightly. I smiled. She smelled the coffee. A few minutes later, she was outside with me, both of us sitting on the deck, hands wrapped around our mugs, staring at the fog in silence. It was Angela who finally broke it. "It's not retreating." I glanced at her. "What?" She gestured toward the mass of gray swallowing the forest. "Look at the way it moves. It's not shifting. It's just growing." I hadn't noticed before, but now that she said it, she was right. Fog, in theory, should have some kind of ebb and flow. It should thin in places, move with the wind, give and take as it drifts. But this was just spreading, devouring, gaining ground without ever giving any back. Angela sipped her coffee. "It's like a wildfire. The way the animals reacted, the way it's closing in. But there's no fire." She looked at me. Just the silence. A cold weight settled in my gut. Angela set her mug down and ran a hand through her tangled hair. I knew I made the right call leaving when I did. I nodded. She told me about her hike, about how the animals had fled in waves, first in small numbers, then in larger groups. By the time she was halfway to my tower, she had seen bears, foxes, coyotes, rabbits, all running south, all ignoring each other, just moving. And then, after the last of them passed, the quiet. Angela looked down at her mug, turning it in her hands. It was the worst thing I've ever felt. That kind of silence, like being the last person alive. I didn't say anything, because I felt it now too. We spent the next hour debating. Do we stay? Do we leave? Angela wanted to run now. Put as much distance between us and the fog as possible. I wanted to wait. The helicopter was coming. But so was the fog. I was standing out on the deck checking the fog's position again, when Angela called me from inside. "Chucky, come look at this." Her voice sounded off. I stepped inside. She was by the bunk, standing next to the wall. The bed had been pushed away from it. I frowned. "What are you—" Then I saw it. A message, carved into the wooden wall of the tower. The words were deep and rough, like a message left in case of an emergency, hidden behind the bed. I stepped closer, running my fingers over the letters. Leave before it comes, for if it comes, you won't ever leave. Below it, carved in smaller letters, head southwest. Then next to it was carved a name, Malcolm. Angela and I stared at it. Neither of us spoke. I felt a cold prickle run down my spine. He had been in this tower for over 30 years, and before he left, he had left us this message. Angela swallowed. We're leaving. I nodded. We packed fast. Food, water, first aid. A few layers of clothing for warmth. The walkies. Nothing extra. No room for luxuries. It was a long hike to the southwest. We had no idea what we were heading toward, only that Malcolm had left the message for a reason. We weren't going to wait around to find out why. Angela double-checked the straps on her pack, then looked at me. We go now? I nodded. We go now. The descent from the tower was nerve-wracking. The wooden steps groaned beneath our weight, the wind clawing at us from all sides. I could feel Angela's urgency, the way she kept glancing back at the horizon. By the time our boots hit the dirt, I could feel it too. Something was wrong. The forest was as quiet as a tomb. Angela adjusted her pack. Southwest, right? I nodded. We started walking. The first mile was uneventful. The trail was rough, but we moved fast. The wind howled through the trees, but that was it. No other sounds. No birds, no insects, nothing. The silence felt bigger than the forest itself. Angela's voice was hushed when she finally spoke. I hate this. I didn't answer, because so did I. By the time we reached the second mile, I stopped to check the fog's position. I turned back toward the tower, raising my binoculars, and my stomach dropped. It was closer. Way closer. Angela saw my face before I could say anything. What? I hesitated. It's moving faster. Angela swallowed. I didn't want to say what I was thinking, but it was too obvious to ignore. It had sped up after sunset last night, and now, in the early morning gloom, it was still moving fast. I checked my watch. We'd been hiking for less than an hour, but in that time the fog had closed the distance by miles. Angela wiped her palms against her jeans. We have to move faster. I nodded. Let's go. We picked up the pace. By the fourth mile, I was sweating. We had been hiking hard, pushing forward as fast as possible without completely exhausting ourselves. The ridge wasn't far now. Angela stopped suddenly. What? She pointed. We had reached higher ground, and from this vantage point, we could see the land stretching out behind us. And the fog. It was trailing us. Not creeping. Not drifting. It was coming, like something alive. Angela let out a sharp breath. I checked my watch again. The speed didn't make sense. It had been miles behind us when we left the tower. It should still be miles behind us. But it wasn't. It was hunting us. Angela looked at me. We need to run. We ran. We tore down the ridge as fast as we could, feet pounding the dirt. I could hear my own breath, ragged and sharp. The trees blurred past as we pushed through the undergrowth, ignoring the sting of branches whipping against our arms. 30 minutes later, we reached another high point and risked a look back. The fog was cresting the ridgeline. Angela let out a strangled noise. We're out of time. I scanned the land ahead. A cave. Not far. Maybe a 5-minute sprint. Angela saw it too. There! She shouted. Go! We ran. We tore down the ridge as fast as we could, feet pounding the dirt. I could hear my own breath, ragged and sharp. The trees blurred past as we pushed through the undergrowth, ignoring the sting of branches whipping against our arms. 30 minutes later, we reached another high point and risked a look back. The fog was cresting the ridgeline. Angela let out a strangled noise. We're out of time. I scanned the land ahead. A cave. Not far. Maybe a 5-minute sprint. Angela saw it too. "There!" she shouted. "Go!" We ran. I could feel the weight of my pack digging into my shoulders, but I didn't slow down. My breath came in ragged bursts, my pulse pounding in my ears. Angela was a few steps ahead of me, her pace frantic but steady. She wasn't looking back anymore. Neither was I. We didn't need to. The fog was coming. The cave entrance was just ahead, a dark, jagged hole in the rock face, wide enough for us to slip inside. We scrambled down the final stretch, Angela reaching the entrance first. She stopped so suddenly that I almost collided into her. I barely had time to register the etched words on the stone before she turned to me, her eyes wide. Malcolm was here. I looked at the rock. 3 words had been carved into the stone. Safe past water. I didn't know what it meant, but we weren't going to stand there and figure it out. Angela grabbed my arm. Inside. Now. We ducked into the cave, switching on our flashlights as the darkness swallowed us. The air inside was cold. The sound of our footsteps echoed as we moved deeper into the passageway, following its twists and turns. The walls were rough, jagged, the ceiling low enough in some places that we had to duck. Then, a sound. A muffled, distant noise, low and unnatural, drifting in from behind us. Angela's grip tightened around her flashlight. That's not the wind. I turned off my light. Keep moving. The tunnel sloped downward as we pressed forward, and then, a sound ahead. Running water. Angela sucked in a breath. That's what Malcolm meant. We pushed forward until we turned a final corner and then, a river, deep inside the cave. Our flashlights illuminated the water, which flowed steadily through the cavern. The passage continued on the other side, but the only way across was to wade through it. Angela looked back toward the tunnel behind us. We could still hear the noises, growing louder, getting closer. She stepped into the water first, gasping at the cold, then waded across. The current wasn't strong, but the chill was unbearable. By the time we reached the other side, I could see it. A small, abandoned campsite. Malcolm's. Angela shivered as she pulled off her soaked jacket. "We stay here." I nodded. Behind us, the sounds from the tunnel were growing louder. We killed our flashlights, and we waited. The sounds grew louder. At first, it was just the wind, or what we told ourselves was the wind. A low, hollow moan moving through the tunnels behind us. But then came the screaming. It started distant, faint. Then it grew. Not one voice, but dozens. Hundreds. Twisting together in a way that didn't make sense. Some of them were sobbing. Some of them were laughing. Angela gripped my arm. Her breath was shaking. "Chucky." I didn't answer, because I didn't trust my voice. The fog was here. We couldn't see it yet, but we could feel it. The air had changed, gone thick and wrong, pressing in against our skin like something unseen was wrapping itself around us. The screams got closer. Angela turned off her flashlight. I did the same. We crouched low, huddling together near the fire pit of the old campsite. The only sound now was the river beside us, rushing through the cavern. Then, the first tendrils of fog slipped into the cave. Thick, curling strands of darkness, twisting along the cavern floor. Angela gripped my hand so hard it hurt. The fog inched closer. Then, it stopped, right at the river's edge. It didn't retreat, didn't move forward, just stood there, writhing at the border of the water like something alive. And inside of it, the faces, dozens of them, twisting, screaming, mouths open in silent agony. Angela let out a tiny, strangled sound. I turned off my flashlight because I couldn't look at it anymore. We stayed like that for what felt like forever. The screaming never stopped, but the fog never crossed the river. At some point, exhaustion won over fear. We huddled under a sleeping bag, curled up against the cold stone, and somehow, fell asleep. We woke up to silence. No screams. I clicked on the flashlight. No fog. Only the sound of rushing water. Angela was the first to move. She sat up, blinking groggily, then looked at me. "Is it over?" I didn't answer, because I didn't know. We crossed the river, stepping cautiously back to the other side. My boots squelched against the wet stone. Angela reached the mouth of the cave first. She froze. Then she stepped into the sunlight. The fog was gone, and for the first time in days, the sun was shining. The unnatural cold was gone, now replaced by the warmth of a June morning. A warmth that had been absent ever since we spotted the fog, creeping over the eastern horizon. The world outside the cave was different. The sky was clear for the first time in days, but the forest was dead silent. Not the creeping, unnatural quiet of before. This was something else. Something emptier. Angela turned in a slow circle, scanning the trees. "It's gone." I stepped up beside her. The fog had vanished completely. No trace of it. Not even the lingering dampness that regular fog leaves behind. It was just gone. Angela exhaled, running a hand through her tangled hair. "Now what?" I lifted my radio. For the first time in days, a clear signal. The rescue chopper arrived hours later. We were waiting in the clearing when we heard it, the distant whoomp, whoomp, whoomp of rotor blades cutting through the silence. Angela let out a shuddering breath. I didn't realize I had been holding mine until I exhaled, my body sagging with exhaustion. The helicopter touched down, kicking up dirt and leaves. 2 men in uniforms hopped out, one of them a pilot, the other wearing a park ranger badge. But something about him was off. His posture was too stiff, his expression too blank. Angela and I exchanged a glance. Neither of us moved. Then the man gestured sharply. "Let's go." We climbed inside. Back at headquarters, they separated us immediately. A private room, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, a table, a chair. Then, David. He sat across from me, arms folded. His expression was unreadable. "Tell me exactly what happened." So I did. Everything. The fog, the silence, the way the animals fled, Bill's disappearance, Malcolm's message carved into the wall, the cave, the river, the screaming. David didn't say a word. Not until I finished. Then, finally, he sighed. "Thank you for your report." That was it. No follow-up questions. No, "we'll investigate." Nothing. I narrowed my eyes. What happens now? David's mouth twitched slightly, the closest thing to a smile I had seen from him. "You and Angela are being reassigned." That was all he said before he stood and walked out. They held us at HQ for a week. We weren't allowed to leave. They said it was for debriefing, but no one actually debriefed us. Just men in suits walking the halls, people who weren't park employees. Eventually, they told us Bill was missing, presumed dead. They held a small, pathetic memorial service. 23 years as a fire lookout, and all they gave him was a plaque and a moment of silence. Then it was back to business as usual. We received word that the area of the park we had been stationed was closed until further notice. Angela and I indeed were reassigned, ending up nowhere near each other, but we found a way to stay in touch. After a few more years, Angela moved on. She pursued her passion for photography, turning it into a full-time career, and along the way, she met a great guy named Matthew. We stayed close over the years, and when her wedding day came, I was honored to stand by her side as she married the love of her life. I became an honorary uncle to their 2 kids, always there for birthdays and holidays. Each visit felt natural, like I was a true part of the family, taking my place at the table as if I belonged. We never talked about what happened around them, but when we were alone, we still spoke of it quietly, like we were afraid something might be listening, like the fog might come back if we said too much. Because we knew the truth. No one ever came looking for Bill. There was no search, no real questions. And the worst part? I think HQ knew exactly what happened to him. I had spent the years moving from park to park, taking Firewatch assignments all over the country. Always remote locations. Always places with long histories, old legends, whispered warnings. But I never stayed in one place for too long. Never spending more than a couple of seasons at one post. Because I was waiting. Waiting for the moment they would reopen the forest of my first assignment. And when they finally did, I put in my transfer request. I got a few sideways glances from my superiors, but they granted it. However, I did not return to my old tower. I requested Tower East, because this time things would be different. This time, I wouldn't be caught off guard. I had spent years preparing, waiting, watching, moving from park to park, keeping my distance, biding my time. But now, I was exactly where I needed to be. I had positioned myself at the front lines. Because when the fog returned, and I knew without a shadow of a doubt that it would return, I would be the first to see it. I would be the one to sound the alarm before it was too late. Because thanks to Malcolm, I knew the truth. I knew what to do. I knew how to save anyone stationed at Tower North and Tower Southwest. And when the fog comes again, because it is not a question of if, but when, I will be ready.